It was midnight when Amelia Hart reached across her own counter and grabbed a stranger by the hand, and some small, cold part of her already understood she had just made a mistake she couldn't take back. She was 31. She'd owned the bakery on Hollow Lane for 6 years, and in all that time she had never once touched a customer without being asked first. She didn't even know this man's name. She only knew the shape of him after 30 nights of watching, that he came alone, always after the last customer had gone, always dressed like he'd wandered out of a century that didn't exist anymore, that his coat was black, embroidered in silver thread that seemed to shift when the candlelight moved across it, that a deep red stone hung at his throat, resting there the way old, patient things rest, like it had been waiting, that he ordered the same pastry every night and rarely finished it, that the security camera above the register never caught his face quite right, no matter how many times she checked, that he never once shivered, not even in December, not even when the door let the wind in behind him. There were other things too, smaller, harder to say out loud. The way conversation in the bakery seemed to quiet itself when he was inside it, as if the air knew something the customers didn't. The way frost never touched the window nearest his usual seat, even on nights cold enough to crack the pipes. The way she sometimes caught herself holding her breath without deciding to, the way you do standing too close to the edge of something tall. That was all she knew. It had never felt like enough. Tonight, it felt like nothing at all. She wasn't looking at him when the bell over the door rang a second time. She was looking at the envelope on the counter, the one with the hospital seal, the one with a stain across the corner she hadn't let herself examine too closely. Nora's name was on it. So was tomorrow's date. Then the bell rang, and Amelia looked up to see who had come in, and something behind her face simply stopped. She didn't turn around. She didn't let go of the stranger's hand, either. She leaned toward him and said 5 words in the small, careful voice of someone asking to borrow something she already knew she couldn't repay. "Just pretend you're my husband," she didn't explain. There wasn't time, and even if there had been, she didn't know where an explanation like that would begin. The stranger looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked past her, toward the door, and Amelia felt his fingers close slowly around hers. Not comforting, deliberate, like a decision being made. Pretend. His voice had gone very quiet, and quiet on him did not feel safe at all. It felt like the moment before something louder. If this is already under your skin, hit like, share it with someone who needs a little dread with their romance tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, back to Hollow Lane, back to midnight, back to the 5 words Amelia Hart was about to regret, or be saved by, and wouldn't know which for a long, long time. Sebastian Crow crossed the bakery floor like the building already belonged to him. He set a folder on the glass counter, and he set it down gently. The particular gentleness of a man who has done this before and knows that softness lands harder than force ever could. He told her, without raising his voice, that the funding board he sat on controlled Nora's treatment schedule, that the deadline was sunrise, that he understood small businesses had hard months, but the hospital's ledgers didn't understand anything at all. Amelia didn't sign. She looked instead at the hand still folded around hers, and something in her chest, fear maybe, or the last scrap of a decision she'd already made without meaning to, pushed the words out again. "He's my husband." Sebastian's gaze dropped to their hands. For exactly 1 second, something moved behind his composed, expensive face. Not confusion, recognition, the look of a man doing very fast arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "And you are?" he asked, too evenly. The stranger set down the pastry he'd been holding, unhurried, and brushed the crumbs from his fingers one at a time, as if the room could wait for him. Then he gave his name, only his name. No title, no context, no reason offered for why a man dressed like old money and older secrets was standing in a bakery at midnight holding a stranger's hand like it belonged to him. The room went so quiet Amelia could hear the ovens ticking as they cooled behind her. Sebastian didn't reach for the folder again. He said, in a voice that had lost every trace of the patience it started with, that they'd continue this another time. He was through the door before the bell finished ringing, and Amelia noticed she would think about this later, in the dark, more than once, that he didn't look back. She pulled her hand free so fast, she nearly knocked the envelope off the counter. She started apologizing immediately, for grabbing him, for the lie, for whatever debt this had just become between two people who'd never exchanged more than a pastry and exact change. He let her finish. He didn't interrupt once. Then his gaze moved to the door Sebastian had just fled through, and when he spoke again, his voice had traveled somewhere older and stiller than anything she'd heard from him in a month of nights. Your mother never told you what that mark means. It wasn't a question. It didn't have the shape of one. Amelia's hand rose to her collarbone before she gave it permission to. The fabric of her dress hadn't shifted. Nothing about her had changed since the last time she looked in a mirror. She had never shown him that mark. She had never shown it to anyone. Not the doctors, not Nora's father, not a single soul outside the four walls of the room she grew up in, where her mother used to press two fingers over it and tell her very quietly that some things were safer forgotten. She looked up at the stranger standing across her own counter in her own bakery on an ordinary Tuesday that had stopped being ordinary somewhere in the last 4 minutes, and understood, with a certainty that settled into her like cold water finding the bottom of a glass, that she had not spent 30 nights serving pastries to an eccentric rich man. She had spent 30 nights letting something else learn her name, her habits, the exact hour she locked the front door, and the exact window where the frost never came. And now it knew her secret, too. The one she'd never spoken aloud in her own bakery, in her own life, to a single living soul. It had just told her so. She didn't ask him to leave. That was the strange part. The part she'd turn over later alone, at 2 in the morning. That some old, stubborn instinct told her the safest thing in the bakery right now was the one thing that had just proven it wasn't safe at all. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. How did you know? He didn't pretend not to understand her. That too she'd remember later. How he never once made her repeat herself. Never once played dumb to buy time. He simply looked at her collarbone, where the fabric of her dress covered a mark she had spent 31 years keeping covered, and said nothing. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. Then give me one. He was quiet long enough that the silence started to feel like its own kind of answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone careful in a way she hadn't heard from him before. The voice of a man choosing which doors to leave shut. Not tonight. There are things I could tell you that you're not ready to hear, and things I won't tell you because they'd put you in more danger, not less. He paused. Sebastian Crow is not what you think he is. He's a man who wants my bakery. He's a man who wants to watch you lose everything you love, one piece at a time. And he has done it before, to people who never saw it coming. Something moved behind his eyes when he said it. Not anger exactly, older than anger. You should be more afraid of him than you are of me. Amelia almost laughed. She didn't know what she was afraid of, standing across the counter from a man who just recited her family's darkest secret like a weather report. But she filed the sentence away anyway, because underneath the strangeness of the night, some practical part of her had already reached its own conclusion. He had money. He had a presence that made grown men retreat without being touched. And men like that had a type. She'd met his kind before, in boardrooms she used to work in a lifetime ago. Rich men collected leverage the way other people collected stamps. He didn't correct her. She noticed that too, though she wouldn't understand what it meant for a long while yet. The bell rang before she could ask anything else. Nora came through the door the way she came through every door, fast, a little sideways, backpack half off one shoulder, and stopped dead when she saw him. "You're the silver-haired man," she announced, delighted, like she'd solved something. Amelia opened her mouth to apologize for her daughter's bluntness. She didn't get the chance. "I am," he said, and something in his posture changed. Some careful, deliberate softening, like a man setting down something heavy so he could hold something small instead. He crouched, unhurried, to something closer to Nora's height. "And you must be the one who draws the pictures." Nora's whole face lit. "How do you know about my pictures?" "Your mother mentions you. Constantly." A pause. "I've heard about the tree that changes colors in the wrong season." Amelia hadn't told him that. She was almost certain she hadn't told him that. Nora climbed onto the stool beside him without being invited, the way she did with almost no one, and asked why he only ever bought one pastry. He looked at the tart still sitting, mostly untouched, in its paper box. Because I was waiting for someone to share the second one with. Nora considered this with the total seriousness of an 8-year-old auditing a stranger's life choices, then nodded, satisfied, as if he'd passed some test she hadn't told anyone she was administering. Amelia watched them together, and felt something in her chest twist sideways. Not suspicion, exactly. Something closer to the ache of hoping for a thing she'd trained herself out of hoping for. She busied herself behind the counter, so neither of them would see her face. She didn't see, because she wasn't looking for it the moment Nora's hand went briefly absently to her own chest. A small pressing motion there and gone. The kind of thing an exhausted mother learns to stop noticing, because noticing it changes nothing. She didn't see Lucian go very still. She didn't see his eyes track the movement, or the flicker of something old and grave cross his face before he smoothed it away. He had heard it before she'd even touched her chest. The half-beat stutter in the child's pulse. Off rhythm. Wrong in a way no doctor's stethoscope had ever been built to notice. He'd heard it the moment she walked through the door, threaded under the ordinary sound of a child's heartbeat like a second quieter clock running slightly out of time with the first. He said nothing. Not yet. Later, when Nora leaned across the counter to reach for a napkin, her collar shifted, and for half a second, Amelia's own mark caught the candlelight, the old symbol beneath her collarbone, the one her mother had warned her never to show anyone glowing faint and red as a coal before the fabric fell back into place. Lucian did not move. He did not breathe, in the specific way he'd learned not to, 300 years ago, when breathing had stopped mattering and old habits had simply refused to die with everything else. The crimson moon. He had seen that mark exactly once before on a woman who had vanished into the dark 3 centuries ago and never resurfaced, a woman his court had mourned as dead, a bloodline he had personally watched disappear into legend and dust. He had spent 300 years believing the last of it was gone. It was not gone. It was standing behind a pastry counter, wiping crumbs from a countertop, laughing softly at something her daughter had said. His phone lit against the counter, silent, a single line from a name he trusted with very little. "They've found you. They know about the girl." Lucian looked up at Amelia, still smiling, still unaware, wiping down a counter in a bakery that suddenly felt very small and very exposed, and felt for the first time and longer than he could measure, something close to fear. He had stopped being afraid for himself long ago. That fear had worn itself out somewhere in the 2nd century, not for himself. He was afraid, purely and completely, for her. He left before she could ask why his face had changed. Amelia told herself it didn't matter. She locked up an hour later than usual, walked Nora upstairs, sat with her until her breathing evened out into sleep, and came back down to take the trash out to the alley behind the bakery. The same 14 steps she'd walked 1,000 times, the same door, the same cold. Nothing about it should have felt different. It felt different. The alley light was out. She noticed that first, the small practical part of her mind already composing a note to call the landlord. And it was that ordinary thought, call the landlord, that she was still holding when she realized she wasn't alone. There were 4 of them. She would only ever remember that number with any certainty, though later trying to describe it to herself in the dark, she'd swear there had been more, spreading out along the alley the way water finds the edges of a room. They didn't look like anything. That was the worst part. Not monsters. Just men. Ordinary jackets. Ordinary faces. One of them holding something that caught what little light there was and turned it into a thin silver line. She thought, absurdly, of the men who came to fix the boiler, of how little anyone ever looked like what they'd come to do. Mrs. Hart, one of them said, and the way he used her name made it sound like a key turning in a lock. She dropped the trash bag. She didn't remember deciding to. The one with the blade moved first, fast, faster than she had time to process as a threat before it became one, and she had just enough time to think this is really happening, before the world changed shape around her. He was simply there. Between her and the blade, though, she never saw him cross the distance 1 second. The alley held 4 men, and her the next it held 5, and the 5th had not walked into it so much as arrived. The way weather arrives. The blade came down. His hand closed around it. Not around the handle, around the edge, bare palm against honed steel, and stopped it dead in the air, close enough to Amelia's throat that she felt the air move. He didn't bleed. His eyes, when he looked up, had gone the deep, wet red of the stone at his throat, and the attacker holding the blade made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a word, stumbling backward so fast he nearly went down. "The king," someone whispered, and the whisper moved through the other three like current through water. All four of them, one after another, dropping to the wet stone of the alley with a speed that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with fear. Heads bowed, not one of them looking up again. Amelia stood with her back against the cold brick, breathing too fast, watching a man she had served pastries to for 30 nights straighten slowly, still holding the blade that should have opened his palm to the bone, with no mark on his skin at all. He said something low, in a language she didn't recognize, and the men rose and were simply gone, not running exactly, though it happened too fast to call it walking either. The alley was empty again. It was just the two of them, the dropped trash bag and the cold settling back in, like it had never been disturbed at all, as if the last 30 seconds had happened in some other alley, to some other woman. "You're bleeding," he said, which was absurd because she wasn't, not anywhere he could see, and it took her a moment to understand he meant the way her hands were shaking. "What?" she said, and had to start over. "What are you?" He looked at her for a long moment, the red draining slowly back out of his eyes until they were simply dark again, simply his. When he answered, his voice had none of the careful evasiveness from earlier that night. It had the flat, weighted honesty of a man who has decided there's no version of this that doesn't require the whole truth. "My name is Lucien Vare. I am 406 years old." He let that sit a moment before continuing. "I am the Vampire King. My family has ruled beneath the world you know for longer than your country has existed. And 300 years ago, a bloodline stood beside mine, the Crimson Moon line. I believe the last of it died with a woman who carried it." A pause, careful, deliberate. "I was wrong. You're the last of it, Amelia. You're the last surviving descendant." She waited for the fear to arrive properly, the way it should have, given what she'd just watched him do with his bare hand. It didn't come. What came instead, rising up through the shock, was something sharper and more familiar, something that had nothing to do with kings or bloodlines at all. It was the same old tired anger she'd carried for years, the one that had nothing to do with vampires and everything to do with every powerful person who had ever assumed her trust could simply be assumed, never earned. "You knew," she said. "This whole time. You knew what that mark meant. You knew what I was, and you let me stand there apologizing to you for grabbing your hand like an idiot. Amelia, I don't care that you're a king." And she meant it in the moment, more than she'd expected to. Kings were an abstraction. Lies were not. "I care that you let me think I'd imagined all of it. 30 nights, Lucien. Why have you been coming into my bakery?" He didn't look away from her, which she would think about later. How much that had mattered. "The pastry reminded me of my mother's." That part was true. "I have not lied to you about that." His jaw tightened, but it wasn't the only reason. "I recognized your blood the first night you handed me the box. I have spent 3 centuries believing that scent was gone from the world." The alley felt very small and very cold, and Amelia found she had wrapped both arms around herself without deciding to, as though her body had understood before the rest of her caught up. Exactly how much the ground beneath her life had just moved. "What does that make, Nora?" she asked, and heard her own voice crack on the second word. Something shifted in his face. The last of the composure she'd watched him wear all month, finally giving way to something graver, older, and afraid in a way she hadn't seen from him even with a blade an inch from her throat. "Your daughter," he said slowly, like each word cost him something, "is not sick in the way your doctors believe." "Not sick in the way your doctors believe" was not a sentence Amelia could carry back upstairs and set down anywhere. She stood in the alley with it for a long moment, the cold working its way through her sweater, and then she said the only thing that made sense to say. "Show me." He examined Nora that night, after Amelia woke her gently, and explained none of it, only that the silver-haired man wanted to make sure she was feeling well. A lie so thin, Nora saw through it instantly and pretended not to, the way children do when they've decided an adult needs the mercy more than the truth. She asked him, half asleep, if he was going to check her heartbeat like the hospital doctors did, with the cold metal disc that always made her flinch. He told her he wouldn't need it. She thought that was a very strange thing for a grown-up to say, and told him so, and then fell back asleep. Before he could answer, Lucian knelt at the child's bedside, 2 fingers resting light as breath against the inside of her wrist, his eyes closed, listening to something Amelia couldn't hear at all. When he opened his eyes again, the graveness she'd seen in the alley had deepened into something closer to grief. Her heart, he said quietly, once they were back downstairs, once Nora was asleep again, keeps 2 rhythms. One is entirely human. The other isn't hers yet. Not fully. It's waiting. Something in her blood is trying to become something else, and her body is fighting it the only way a human body knows how, by getting sick. Amelia's hands had gone very still on the counter. You're telling me, my daughter is turning into… not turning, not yet. Awakening. He chose the word carefully, the way he'd chosen every word since the alley, as if he understood that carelessness now would cost more than it ever had before. She carries the Crimson Moon inheritance, the same as you. In you, it has always been dormant, quiet enough to pass as nothing at all. In her, for reasons I don't yet understand, it isn't staying quiet. Because of you. The words came out low and furious, faster than she meant them to. You people, your world, you didn't exist in my life a month ago, and now my daughter's body is fighting some bloodline you're telling me she inherited from a mother who barely believed in any of it herself. This is because of you. I understand why you'd believe that. He didn't flinch from it, didn't raise his voice to match hers, and something about his stillness made her anger harder to hold on to than it would have been against resistance. But I didn't know you existed a month ago, Amelia. I didn't know Nora existed until the night she walked through your door and called me the silver-haired man. Whatever is happening in her blood began before I ever tasted your pastries. I am not its cause. I only recognized it. The fury didn't leave her. It just had nowhere left to land, and that was almost worse. Then fix it, she said. You said you could save her. I can. He met her eyes, and for the first time all night, she saw something in his face that looked less like a king and more like a man choosing his next words with real dread. But the only way to save her is to help her blood finish what it's already started. If I do this, her human life, the ordinary version of it, the one where she grows up worrying about spelling tests instead of what she is, ends tonight. What emerges will be stronger, healthier, safe from the illness entirely. But it will not be the daughter you have now. Amelia felt the floor of the conversation drop away beneath her. And if you don't, then her body keeps fighting a war it cannot win indefinitely. I don't know how much time that buys her. I won't lie to you and pretend I do. She turned away from him, both hands pressed flat against the counter, staring at nothing. At the pastry case, at the chalk numbers she'd rewritten 100 times trying to make this bakery survive one more month. Save Nora and lose the only version of her daughter she'd ever known. Or keep that version a little longer and lose her entirely. I can't make that choice, she said, very quietly. Nobody should have to make that choice. I know. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. Didn't offer the easy comfort of a hand on her shoulder. And I won't make it for you, and I won't push you toward either answer. Whatever you decide it because it's right for her, not because a king told you what his world requires. A pause. You don't owe me your daughter, Amelia. Whatever debt you think this puts between us, there isn't one. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself since the alley, since the folder, since 30 nights of watching a stranger eat one pastry and never explain himself. Underneath the crimson eyes and the 4 centuries and the men who knelt at his feet, there was a man standing very still in her bakery, refusing to make her decision easier by making it for her. It was, she realized with something like vertigo, the first genuinely selfless thing anyone had offered her since Nora's diagnosis. Without meaning to, she reached out and touched his hand. The mark beneath her collarbone flared to life. Not painful, exactly, but bright, urgent, a heat spreading outward from her chest like something long asleep had just opened its eyes. Lucian went rigid. For one disorienting second, he could hear her heartbeat as clearly as his own, could feel it as if her pulse had rerouted itself through his own veins. And Amelia saw him, not the king, a boy, younger than she'd ever imagined him, standing alone beside a grave in some countryside centuries gone, silver hair not yet grown out, red eyes wet with something he was too proud to call grief. She understood in that single unbearable instant exactly why the pastry mattered, why he'd never finished it, why he kept coming back to a taste he could never quite recreate. Then the memory shifted, unbidden, into another. A woman stood in candlelight, a mark glowing beneath her collarbone identical to Amelia's own, her face achingly, impossibly familiar. Amelia's face, or close enough to it that the difference barely mattered, and beside her, hand resting at her waist, stood Lucian, 300 years younger and looking at that woman the way no one had ever looked at Amelia in her life. The vision broke. Amelia pulled her hand back, gasping, one palm pressed to her own chest, as though she could still feel the echo of that other woman's heartbeat lingering beneath her ribs, staring at him with a question she didn't yet have the words to ask. Who was she? Lucian didn't answer right away. He looked, for a moment, like a man deciding whether the truth would break something that couldn't be put back together. Someone who deserves better than a rushed answer at midnight in a bakery, he said finally. There is someone who can tell you properly. She has been waiting 300 years for this conversation. He took her that night to a door in the back of an unremarkable building that shouldn't have led anywhere at all, down a staircase that seemed to last longer than the building above it could have contained, past walls that grew older, with every flightstone giving way to something that looked less built than grown, until the air changed and the sound changed. And Amelia understood, with the particular vertigo of a person crossing a line she can't uncross, that she had left the world she knew. Theodora Vere received them in a room lit entirely by candlelight, seated in a chair positioned like a throne that had simply decided, over the centuries, to look modest instead. She was small, ancient, in a way that had nothing to do with frailty, and she looked at Amelia for a long moment before she spoke, the way a person studies a photograph against a memory to see how well the two still match. "You have your mother's eyes," she said. "I wondered, if I ever saw them again, whether I would recognize them. I do. You knew my mother. I knew what your mother was, which very few people in the end were permitted to know." Theodora gestured to the chair across from her, and Amelia sat because her legs had decided for her. "Your mother was not merely human, child, whatever she raised you to believe. She was the last guardian of the Crimson Moon line, sworn to protect it, to carry it, and if necessary, to disappear with it entirely rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. She never told me any of this. She couldn't. Telling you would have been the fastest way to lose you." Theodora's voice softened, though nothing about her posture did. "She knew Lucian would find you eventually. Bloodlines like yours do not stay hidden forever. Not from him. She simply prayed she would have enough years to prepare you first. She suppressed the mark herself, child, buried it under enough of her own blood, and will that it would sleep until you were old enough to survive what waking it would cost you." Amelia sat with that, and felt something in her chest crack open along a seam she hadn't known was there. 31 years of small, unexplained things suddenly arranged themselves into a shape that made a terrible, coherent sense. "She wasn't hiding from this world," she said slowly. "Understanding arriving in pieces, each one a memory, reorganizing itself around a truth she'd never had. The warnings about the mark. The locked room at the back of the house Amelia was never once allowed into, not even to look. The stories her mother used to tell, half fairy tale and half warning, about a king beyond the forest who could hear a heartbeat from a mile away. The way her mother flinched, once at a symbol embroidered on a stranger's coat in a crowded market, and never explained why. "She wasn't running from you," Amelia said. "She was protecting me from you, from all of it. She gave up everything to keep me out of this." "She gave up everything," Theodora agreed quietly, "because she loved you more than she feared losing you to it." Amelia didn't cry, She wanted to, and didn't, because crying felt like it belonged to a version of this night that was still small enough to survive privately, and this one wasn't. The court received her the next evening, and it did not receive her kindly. She walked beside Lucien through a hall that made the throne room look modest, and some of the vampires gathered there bowed as she passed. A slow ripple of motion, deference offered with visible reluctance. Others didn't move at all. One, tall and pale and dressed like old wealth given a longer life to refine itself in, stepped directly into her path. "A human cannot sit beside our king," he said, not to her, but past her, to Lucien, as though she were a piece of furniture being discussed for placement. Amelia felt Lucien go still beside her, felt the air around him change the way it had in the alley. She spoke before he could. "Then your king should find another wife." The hall went silent in a way that felt total, the kind of silence that has weight. Lucien looked at her, and something at the corner of his mouth moved that wasn't quite a smile, though it wanted to be one. The vampire who'd spoken didn't have an answer ready for that. He inclined his head stiffly and stepped aside. Later, in a corridor lined with windows looking out over a city that existed nowhere on any map Amelia had ever seen, Lucien told her the truth plainly. "I don't need a queen who obeys me," he said. "I have obedience in abundance. I have never once had someone willing to stand in front of my own court and tell me no." "Don't mistake this for staying," Amelia said. "I'm not doing this for a throne or for you. I'm doing it for Nora. The moment she's safe, I take her home." "I wouldn't expect anything else from you," he said, and meant it. And something about the honesty of that landed harder than flattery ever could have. Neither of them saw the guard slip away from his post near the hall's outer door, moving with the unhurried discretion of a man who has done this kind of work before. He found a quiet corridor, drew a small mirror-black device from inside his coat, and spoke 4 words into it, low enough that even the sharpest ears in that hall didn't catch them. "The Queen has been found." Across the city in an office with no windows and no name on the door, Sebastian Crow read the message twice, set down his glass, and for the first time in longer than anyone in his organization could remember, smiled. The slow, satisfied smile of a man who has spent years laying a very long trap and has just watched the last piece of it fall quietly into place. Sebastian Crow had waited a very long time for that smile. He set the device down beside his glass and allowed himself, for exactly 1 minute, the luxury of stillness, the kind of stillness a man permits himself only after years of patient, invisible work have finally paid out. He thought briefly of every dead end that had preceded this one, the false leads in Prague, the bloodline that turned out to be nothing more than a coincidence of birthmarks in Lisbon, the decade he'd spent certain the line had simply gone extinct. None of it mattered now. Then he stood, crossed to the wall behind his desk, and pressed his palm against a panel that looked, to anyone who had never been invited into this room, like ordinary wood paneling. The wall opened onto a chamber the hospital board had no idea existed, in a building they believed they controlled. The Order of the Hollow Sun had been hunting the Crimson Moon bloodline since before hospitals existed at all, since before most of the countries funding them existed in fact. Back when hunting Lucien Weyr's line had been a matter of torches and silver instead of shell corporations and investment portfolios. Sebastian had inherited the hunt the way other men inherit a family business, except the family business had no retirement plan and no acceptable failure. He had spent 11 years disguised as exactly what he appeared to be, a patient, wealthy, unremarkable man who funded hospitals and sat on boards and never once raised his voice. He had never expected the heir to walk into his hands wearing a baker's apron. The hospital funding had never been about the money. It had been the only lever precise enough to apply pressure without revealing his hand. Cancel a treatment, extend a deadline, cancel it again, and watch which desperate mother reached for a solution too fast and too visibly to be ordinary. He hadn't known, at first, that Amelia Hart was the solution he was looking for. He had simply known someone in that neighborhood carried the old blood, faint as it was, and mothers under enough pressure eventually did something that gave them away. Amelia had done better than give herself away. She had led him straight to the king. And then 3 days ago, one of his people had drawn a sample from Nora's last hospital visit. Routine, unremarkable, the kind of blood work no grieving mother questions. And the results had made even Sebastian's carefully maintained composure slip for a moment. The girl wasn't merely descended from the crimson moon line. She carried it active in her blood, tangled together with something else entirely, a thread of Lucian's own royal lineage, dormant, unclaimed, waiting. Sebastian didn't fully understand the mechanism yet. He didn't need to. He understood what it meant. A weapon forged from that blood wouldn't merely wound a creature 4 centuries old. It would kill him, permanently, the way nothing else in 300 years of hunting had managed to. He had not engineered Nora's illness. That much at least was true. And it was the one truth he intended to let Amelia keep, because cruelty for its own sake was inefficient. And Sebastian did not believe in inefficiency. He had simply recognized what her illness meant, and understood immediately that a dying child was worth more to his cause than a healthy one, so long as she stayed dying long enough for her mother to make exactly the kind of desperate choice that had brought Lucien Vare out of hiding. Everything else had simply followed from there. He picked up his phone and typed a short message to a contact inside the Vare court, a contact he had cultivated slowly, patiently over 2 years. Someone who believed, not entirely wrongly, that a human queen would be the end of everything their kind had built. Sebastian didn't need to share his goals with the man. He only needed their goals to overlap for one more night. "It's time," he wrote. "Bring me the girl." Amelia felt it before she understood it. The particular, sinking recognition of pieces sliding into a shape she should have seen weeks ago. The hospital deadline that had arrived with surgical precision. The bakery pressure that made no financial sense for a man of Sebastian's resources, unless the bakery had never been the point. The men in the alley, who hadn't been paid thugs so much as scouts, testing how close they could get before Lucien intervened. Nora's illness worsening on a timeline that lined up, she realized now with a cold drop in her stomach, almost exactly with the weeks Sebastian had been circling her life. She hadn't been an unlucky single mother, caught in the wrong investor's crosshairs. She had been hunted from the very first night Lucien walked into her bakery, and possibly before that, and she had spent a month mistaking a siege for bad luck. "He's known the whole time," she said, when Lucien found her standing rigid in the corridor outside Theodora's chambers. "Not guessed, known, since before you ever bought a pastry from me." "I believe you're right," Lucien said grimly, and something in the set of his jaw told her he'd arrived at the same conclusion, likely faster than she had, and simply hadn't said it aloud yet. Neither of them noticed the guard standing near the chamber's outer archway, the same one who had already sent word that the queen had been found, quietly slip a second message from his coat, and glance just once. Toward the corridor Amelia had come from, weighing something in his expression that had nothing to do with loyalty to his king. They found Nora's room empty an hour later, and the silence in that hallway was worse, somehow, than anything Amelia had felt in the alley or the court before it. A silence with a shape, an absence at its center exactly the size of her daughter. The window stood open, curtains lifting gently in a draft that shouldn't have existed this deep beneath the world. On the bed, undisturbed, lay a single black rose, its petals so dark they seemed to swallow the candlelight around them rather than reflect it. Beneath it, folded once, was a note in handwriting Amelia had never seen before and would never forget. Small, precise, almost gentle, the handwriting of someone who had written a great many notes exactly like it and had learned, long ago, that terror needed no exclamation marks to land. "Bring the queen to the old cathedral." "You're not coming." "I am." Amelia was already pulling her coat off the hook by the door, and her hands, she noticed, had finally stopped shaking. "That wasn't a request, Lucien. That was an itinerary. It's a cathedral controlled by a man who has spent 11 years planning this exact night. It's not, say, fragile." She turned to face him, and something in her voice had gone very flat, very steady. "Say it, and I'll walk to the old cathedral myself, and you can catch up when you're finished deciding I can't handle it." He didn't say it. She watched him choose not to, watched the argument die behind his teeth, and something in his expression shifted into what looked almost like respect, wearing the mask of frustration. "You found your queen," she said. "Now, stop treating her like something fragile. The cathedral stood at the edge of the old district, its spires black against a sky that never seemed to fully clear this far beneath the human world, arched windows catching what little light existed and throwing it back distorted, the way the bakery's windows had once caught candlelight, on a night that felt now like it belonged to someone else's life. Amelia noticed the echo of it immediately. The same Gothic bones, the same sense of a beautiful thing built to hold something dangerous. As though whoever had first designed a place for her and Lucian to meet had drawn the same blueprint twice, once for a beginning, and once apparently for whatever this was about to become. Sebastian was waiting for them at the altar, unhurried, hands folded, like a man greeting late guests at a dinner party he'd never doubted they'd attend. "She's alive," he said, before Amelia could ask, before her voice could break on the question. "Sleeping, actually. I find hysterical children slow down conversation." He gestured almost politely to a side chapel where Amelia could just make out a small, still shape on a stone bench, breathing evenly. Every part of her wanted to run to her. She made herself stay still. "You wanted to know the truth about your bloodline," Sebastian continued, watching her with the patient attention of a man who enjoyed being the only one holding all the pieces. "Let me correct a mistake your new family has been making for 300 years. The prophecy was never, 'The king will choose his queen.' That's the version that let men like him believe they held all the power in this. The true prophecy says the queen chooses the king, not the other way around." His eyes moved to Lucian. "You cannot claim her, your majesty. You never could. She has to choose you, freely, or the bond means nothing at all." Amelia felt something settle into place with the weight of an old lock finally turning. "The bakery," she said slowly. "The night I grabbed his hand. The first time the bond recognized you," Sebastian said almost gently, as if he found it a shame to be the one delivering this particular truth. "You didn't know what you were doing. You still chose him anyway, and something in that ancient, foolish magic decided that counted." A figure stepped from behind one of the cathedral's massive columns, and Amelia recognized him, a half-second before Lucian did. The vampire from the court, the one who'd told her in front of the entire hall that a human couldn't sit beside their king. He looked different here, less composed. The formal stillness he'd worn like armor in the throne room had cracked into something closer to zealotry, the particular unsteady conviction of a man who has talked himself into believing cruelty is protection. "I warned you," he said to Lucian, voice tight with something that had curdled long past reason into conviction. "A human queen will unmake everything we built. I won't let her ruin us to satisfy your loneliness." He moved before anyone could answer him, faster than the men in the alley, faster than anything Amelia had braced herself to expect, and Lucian turned, put himself between the blade and Amelia, in the same motion he'd used to catch a knife with his bare hand 3 nights ago. This time, the blade found him. She heard it before she understood what she'd heard, a sound too quiet for what it meant, and Lucian staggered back a step, one hand pressed to his side, dark blood already spreading between his fingers. "Lucian." "I'm fine," he said, which was a lie. She could see it was a lie in the way his knees had gone unsteady in the gray, pulling into a face that had never once looked less than eternal. 400 years of certainty, draining out of him in real time in front of her. The traitor raised the blade again. Sebastian watched with open, hungry interest, making no move to intervene, content to let his ally finish the work he'd started. Amelia didn't think. She crossed the space between them and took Lucian's hand. The mark beneath her collarbone didn't simply flare this time. It spread, heat racing outward along her collarbone, down her arm, into the hand that gripped his, a light building beneath her skin, the color of the stone at his throat, of old blood, of something that had been sleeping for 31 years and had finally completely woken up. She felt it move through her like a current finding ground, felt centuries of dormant inheritance uncoil inside her chest all at once, and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with fear anymore, exactly what she was. Not a frightened woman who'd asked a stranger to pretend, not a bakery owner in over her head. She was the last of a bloodline that had waited 300 years to be chosen. And she had already made her choice weeks ago without knowing what it cost or what it meant in the small, ordinary act of reaching for a hand across her own counter. Every terrifying thing that had happened since had simply been the world catching up to a decision her heart had made before her mind understood there was one to make. She let go of Lucian only long enough to steady him against the nearest column, and then she turned to face Sebastian, and something in his expression changed for the first time all night, the first crack in 11 years of composure. Her eyes had stopped being entirely her own. She could feel it, the way the candlelight seemed brighter, sharper, the way every breath in the cathedral suddenly had a rhythm she could hear and count and use. "You wanted the queen," Amelia said, and her voice didn't shake at all. She stepped forward. "Now you have her." Sebastian didn't answer her. He raised one hand instead, and above the cathedral's shattered dome, the moon that had been rising all evening finished its slow slide into red, not the ordinary red of atmosphere and dust, but something deeper, wetter. The color of the stone at Lucian's throat, as if the sky itself had decided to take sides. The doors behind them broke open. The order of the hollow sun came through them in a wave. Dozens where the alley had held only 4 dressed for war instead of intimidation, and behind them, moving with less certainty, a scattering of Lucian's own court, drawn here by whatever quiet word the traitor had spread through the halls in the hours before this night. Some of them fought for their king the moment they crossed the threshold. Others hesitated at the edge of the nave, weapons half raised, watching the human woman glowing red at the altar and trying to decide, in real time, whether their world was ending or finally beginning. "Go," Lucian said, one hand still pressed to his side, blood dark between his fingers. "Get to Nora. I'll hold. You can barely stand." Amelia didn't let go of him yet. She could feel, through their joined hands, exactly how much strength the wound had already taken, and something in her, old, awake, entirely her own, refused to leave him bleeding on cathedral stone while she went anywhere alone. He understood, before she said anything else. He worked a heavy ring from his finger, dark metal, a small crimson stone set into it that seemed to pulse faintly in time with the mark still spreading warm beneath her collarbone, and pressed it into her palm. "I trust you with what this means," he said, "more than I have ever trusted anyone with anything." A pause, breath catching against the pain. "Go. I'll be behind you." She didn't put the ring on to look like a queen. She put it on because for the first time in her life, someone had handed her power and meant it as trust, not as a leash, and something in her chest settled at the weight of it. She reached the side chapel through a corridor thick with fighting, past vampires locked in combat too fast for human eyes to properly separate, past the sound of steel, and something older than steel meeting flesh. Nora was exactly where Sebastian had left her, asleep, unmarked, small on a stone bench that had clearly been built for someone much older to kneel at, not for a child to sleep on. Sebastian was already there. "I wondered how long it would take you to choose," he said, not moving from where he stood over the girl. "Motherhood or monarchy? It's rarely both, in my experience. Take the throne and watch her grow up in a world that will never let her be ordinary again, or run tonight, and lose everything Vare's world was ever going to offer you. You think I haven't already made every impossible choice there is?" Amelia's voice had gone very steady. The marks, light, steady beneath her skin now instead of flaring, settled into something closer to breathing than burning. "I spent 8 years being told what my daughter needed. Doctors, funding boards, men exactly like you deciding what was possible for us and what wasn't. Tonight, I decide." She stepped between him and Nora. Sebastian's composure, 11 years in the making, finally broke all the way open. He lunged, not with a blade this time, but with something worse. Some old weapon the Order had built specifically for a night like this, silver-white and humming with a frequency that made the air itself feel wrong. Amelia didn't become something cruel to meet it. She didn't have to. The crimson moon rose in her the way water rises to meet its own level, ancient and patient, and threaded through it. She felt this clearly unmistakably in the half-second before impact, ran something that was unmistakably Lucian's. The royal ring on her finger, answering the mark on her chest like 2 halves of the same old promise. The weapon met her outstretched hand and simply stopped, light unraveling from it in slow red threads, its purpose undone by a bloodline it had been built to kill and a bond it had never been designed to survive. Sebastian staggered back, and for the first time all night, Amelia saw something in his face that wasn't composure at all. It was fear. Behind her, through the corridor, she heard the fighting change shape, heard the Order's ranks break as the weapon's failure rippled outward through whatever unnatural thing had been binding their nerve together, heard Lucian's court finally choosing decisively which side of this history they wanted to be remembered on. The traitor was dragged forward moments later by two of his own former allies, exposed in the red light for exactly what he was. Sebastian didn't run. He simply went very still, and something about his stillness now looked less like control and more like a man finally understanding the size of what he'd spent his life hunting. Amelia didn't kill him. She didn't need to. She only looked at him long enough for him to understand, completely, that he had lost, and then she turned away, because her daughter was still sleeping safely behind her, and nothing left in that cathedral mattered more than that. Lucian found her there minutes later, leaning on a guard who'd stayed loyal. Blood still dark against his side, but the wound no longer widening. Amelia reached for his hand. It was the same motion, almost exactly, as the one she'd made across her own counter a month ago. The same reach, the same open palm, but there was no fear in it this time, no pretending. "I choose you," she said. The mark and the ring answered together, light rising between their joined hands and settling, at last, into something that felt less like power and more like peace. Lucian straightened, the last of the wound's weight lifting from him, as though her choice alone had been the missing half of his own healing. Around them, one by one, the surviving court knelt, not out of fear this time, but because some ancient patient magic in that cathedral had just recognized its queen, and even the ones who had doubted her could feel it settle into the stone beneath their knees. Above them, through the broken dome, the eclipse had already begun to pass, the moon sliding slowly back toward its ordinary silver, as if the sky itself had only ever been waiting to see how the night would end before it let the color go. The court expected a coronation. Amelia gave them a list of demands instead. She stood at the front of the same hall where a stranger had once told Lucian a human couldn't sit beside their king, and this time no one stepped forward to argue with her. The eclipse had passed. The traitor was gone, along with whatever remained of the Order's foothold beneath the city. What was left was a room full of ancient, watchful faces waiting to learn what kind of queen they had just knelt for. "I'm not interested in a throne that requires anyone to be afraid of me," she said, and let the silence hold for a moment before she went on. "So here's what changes, starting tonight." She counted it off on her fingers, the way she used to count inventory behind her own counter. Practical, unhurried, a woman used to making decisions that mattered without theater attached to them. Humans who learned the truth of this world would be protected, not silenced through fear or worse. The old laws that treated human lives as property to be claimed, spent, or discarded ended, effective immediately. Children born between the two worlds, like her own daughter, like whoever came after her, would grow up with a choice, not a destiny handed down before they'd learned to walk. And the court, going forward, answered to both a king and a queen, not one voice wearing two crowns. She waited for the argument. It didn't come. Lucian stepped up beside her, and when he spoke, there was nothing performative in it. No king humoring his new queen for the sake of appearances. "Everything she's asked for," he said, "is already law." It was. She would understand only much later. The final piece of a transformation that had started the night he refused to make Nora's treatment her decision alone. A ruler who had spent 400 years believing that protecting people meant controlling every variable around them, finally choosing to share the one thing he'd never shared with anyone. Nora's treatment happened 3 nights later, in a quiet room with no audience and no ceremony, exactly the way Amelia had asked for it. Lucian worked slowly, carefully, guiding the awakening blood back into something stable instead of forcing it fully into the light. When Nora woke, her fever had broken for the last time. Her supernatural inheritance settled into dormancy again, present, patient, hers to claim someday if she ever chose to, but no longer fighting her small human body for room to exist. "Will I still get sick?" Nora asked, groggy, blinking up at both of them. "No," Lucian said. "Not from this." Nora considered that with the total seriousness of an 8-year-old accepting good news on credit, then asked if she could have pancakes. And Amelia laughed for the first time in what felt like 100 years. They went home to the bakery. Amelia had half expected the court to object, had braced herself for someone explaining that a queen didn't sell croissants for a living. No one did. Lucian didn't even suggest it. He simply asked the first morning back whether the ovens still needed relighting the old-fashioned way. And when she said yes, he lit them himself, without ceremony. Like a man who had spent centuries learning which tasks were beneath a king, and had decided finally that none of them were beneath this one. He kept visiting every night, the way he always had. He still ordered the same pastry. But he didn't stand at the counter anymore, coat buttoned, keeping his distance the way he had for 30 careful nights before any of this began. He sat. Nora climbed onto the stool beside him without being asked, the way she'd claimed him from the very first evening. And Amelia, instead of watching them from behind the register with her heart doing something complicated, came around the counter and sat down too. 3 plates. Every night, without anyone deciding it out loud, 3 plates appeared, where there had only ever been 1. The bakery had become something neither world had a name for. Not entirely human, not entirely the world beneath it. Just the place where both of them had learned, slowly and honestly, how to sit at the same table. One evening, candlelight, lo the castle visible through the arched windows, the way it always had been sitting quietly beyond a doorway, Amelia had once assumed was simply part of the neighborhood's odd charm. Nora looked up from her plate with a particular directness. "Only children manage." "Are you really a king?" Lucian looked at Amelia first, a question in it, though she never learned exactly what he was asking her permission for. Then he looked at Nora. Apparently, Nora took this in the way she took in most impossible things lately, with a small, thoughtful nod, filing it next to vampires and eclipses and blood that remembered things blood shouldn't remember. Then her face lit with the next obvious question. "Does that mean Mom is a queen?" Lucian smiled. The real one. The one Amelia had only seen a handful of times. The one that made him look less like 4 centuries and more like a man who'd finally stopped counting them. Only if she wants to be. Amelia looked at him across the counter, across the same glass she'd wiped clean 1,000 nights before any of this had a name, and reached out and took his hand. She didn't need to pretend this time. There was nothing to explain away. No stranger to fool. No lie to build a shield out of. Just her hand in his, in the bakery where it had all started, exactly as honest as it had ever needed to be. The bakery stayed warm long after closing that night. The castle stood patient beyond the windows, the way it always would. Nora laughed at something only she found funny. Colored pencils already scattered across the counter beside her empty plate. 3 plates sat there, side by side, in a shop that had somehow become the only place in either world where a king could simply sit down. And Lucian Vere, 400 years old, ruler of a kingdom most of the world would never know existed, finally understood that the greatest thing he had ever found in all those centuries wasn't a throne. It was this. It was home.